What would you do if you discovered that the family home you inherited contained evidence of a crime so disturbing that it would forever change how you understood your own history? Would you bring the truth to light, knowing it would tarnish your family name forever? Or would you, like so many before you, choose to bury the past beneath layers of denial and silence? In the early hours of March 14, 1944, Sheriff Deputy Thomas Blackwell was called to investigate an apparent suicide at the Whitmore estate, a sprawling Victorian farmhouse on the outskirts of Elmwood, Arkansas. The deceased was identified as Eleanor Whitmore, a 47-year-old widow who had lived on the property with her 17-year-old daughter, Margaret. According to the official report filed that morning, Eleanor had been found hanging from a ceiling beam in the estate's cellar by Margaret, who had immediately contacted the authorities. Deputy Blackwell's initial assessment concluded that Eleanor Whitmore had taken her own life, citing melancholia as the probable cause. The case was closed within 48 hours. Margaret Whitmore was placed in the care of her maternal aunt, Charlotte Hayes, who resided in Little Rock. The Whitmore estate was sealed, its contents undisturbed for nearly 8 decades, until the discovery that would resurrect this long-forgotten tragedy and expose a darkness far more sinister than anyone had imagined. "I knew something wasn't right the moment I set foot in that house," recalled former Sheriff Deputy Blackwell in his 1968 memoir, Shadows of Elmwood, which was never published due to his sudden death from a heart attack later that year. There was an oppressiveness in the air, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, and the girl Margaret, she didn't cry, not once, just stood there, staring at her mother's body with this expression I still can't rightly describe. Wasn't grief, wasn't shock. It was something else entirely. The Whitmore case might have remained nothing more than a footnote in Elmwood's history had it not been for the persistent curiosity of Eliza Carter, great-niece of Margaret Whitmore and inheritor of the long-abandoned estate in 2022. Upon taking possession of the property, Carter, a 34-year-old librarian from Fayetteville, discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had once been Margaret's bedroom. Inside the compartment was a collection of diaries bound in faded blue leather, their pages yellowed with age but the handwriting still clearly legible. The diaries, 13 in total, chronicled 8 years of Margaret Whitmore's life, from her 9th birthday in 1936 to the day of her mother's death in 1944. What those pages revealed would prompt Carter to contact the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Division, and ultimately lead to the posthumous investigation of Eleanor Whitmore for crimes that defied comprehension. "I never knew my great-aunt Margaret," Carter told investigators in her initial statement. "My mother always said there was some kind of family scandal, but no one would talk about it. Margaret left Arkansas after high school and cut all ties with the family. She died in 1992 without ever returning home. I always wondered what could have driven her away. Now I know, and I almost wish I didn't." The Elmwood Historical Society records describe the Whitmore family as prominent, local figures who had owned and operated one of the largest cotton plantations in Phillips County since before the Civil War. Following the death of Jonathan Whitmore in 1934, his widow Eleanor had maintained the family's social standing despite the economic hardships of the Depression. Known for her charitable contributions to the local church and her active involvement in community affairs, Eleanor Whitmore was, by all public accounts, a model of Southern gentility and maternal devotion. This carefully constructed facade began to crumble on June 23, 2022, when State Police Detective Aaron Michaels opened the first of Margaret Whitmore's diaries. The initial entries appeared innocuous enough, the musings of a young girl documenting her daily activities, her schoolwork, her friendships. But as Detective Michaels progressed through the volumes, a disturbing pattern emerged. The manipulation was subtle at first, explained Dr. Rebecca Foster, forensic psychologist consulted on the case. Eleanor systematically isolated her daughter, gradually removing her from school, limiting her interactions with peers, and fostering a dependency that went far beyond the normal mother-daughter relationship. The diaries document a textbook case of grooming, but with an incestuous element that intensified over time. By 1940, when Margaret was 13 years old, her world had been reduced to the boundaries of the Whitmore estate. Her education was overseen entirely by her mother, Her social interactions were limited to carefully supervised visits with the children of Eleanor's closest friends. And her diary entries began to reflect an increasingly disturbing dynamic. April 10th, 1940. Mother says I am becoming a proper young lady at last. She measured me for new dresses today and said my figure is developing beautifully. Her fingers lingered on my chest in a way that made me uncomfortable, but when I tried to step back, she became very cross. She said a daughter should never shy away from her mother's touch, that it was unnatural and ungrateful. Later, she came to my room to apologize. She brushed my hair for an hour and read to me from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." She kissed my forehead, then my cheeks, then my lips. I didn't know what to do. As the diaries progressed, so too did the nature of Eleanor's violations. What began as inappropriate touches and kisses escalated to more explicit sexual abuse. Margaret's entries became increasingly confused, reflecting the psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical abuse. October 3rd, 1941. Mother says what we share is special, a love deeper than others could understand. She says that's why we must keep it between us. I asked if other mothers and daughters have this kind of relationship. She became angry, said I was being silly and childish, that of course they do, but people are too hypocritical to admit it. Then she cried and asked if I didn't love her anymore. I said I did, I do. But sometimes when she comes to my room at night, I pretend I'm somewhere else. I imagine I'm a bird flying high above the house, so high that nothing can reach me. The investigation uncovered that Eleanor's controlling behavior extended beyond the confines of their home. She maintained careful surveillance of Margaret's limited social interactions, interrogating her after any contact with the outside world and punishing perceived transgressions with increasing severity. Dr. Foster noted, "There's evidence that Eleanor was preparing Margaret to assume a spousal role. She taught her to cook and maintain the household according to her exacting standards. She dressed her in increasingly mature clothing. She referred to her as my little wife in private. And perhaps most disturbing, she began introducing Margaret as her companion rather than her daughter when they traveled outside Elmwood. This pattern became even more explicit following Margaret's 15th birthday, when Eleanor presented her with a gold ring inscribed with their initials. According to Margaret's diary entry from that day, Eleanor placed the ring on her left hand, third finger, and told her, "Now you are mine completely, my darling girl. My wife in all but name." The county records office contained evidence that corroborated aspects of Margaret's diaries. In 1942, Eleanor Whitmore had her will revised to name Margaret as sole beneficiary, referring to her in the document as "my beloved lifelong companion." She also attempted to have Margaret's birth certificate amended, though the request was denied by county officials. Former schoolmates of Margaret, interviewed as part of the cold case investigation, recalled the gradual transformation of the once outgoing child. "Maggie was a bright, talkative little thing when we started school," remembered Doris Jenkins, née Wallace, who attended Elmwood Elementary with Margaret until 1939. But she started missing a lot of days. When she did come, she was different, quiet, jumpy. She flinched if anyone touched her, even accidentally. Then one day she just stopped coming altogether. Mrs. Whitmore told everyone Maggie was being educated at home because she was too sensitive for public school. We all thought it was strange, but folks didn't question that sort of thing back then, especially not when it came to the Whitmores. As Margaret's isolation deepened, so too did her mother's possessiveness. The diaries documented Eleanor's jealous rage whenever Margaret expressed interest in anyone outside their cloistered world. The pages revealed a particular incident in 1943 that marked a dangerous escalation. August 12, 1943. David Pearson smiled at me at church on Sunday. He's the new minister's son, just moved here from Memphis. He has kind eyes. Mother saw him looking at me and gripped my arm so hard it left bruises. When we got home, she said I had been flirting, making a spectacle of myself. She cut off all my hair with kitchen scissors while I cried. Said no boy would look at me now. Said I didn't need anyone but her, that I belonged to her. She burned my prettiest dress in the fireplace and made me watch. Later I heard her on the telephone with Reverend Pearson, telling him terrible lies about David, how he had made improper advances toward me. They're sending him to his uncle's farm in Tennessee. I'll never forgive her for this. The investigation revealed that David Pearson had indeed been sent away from Elmwood in August 1943. Reverend Pearson and his wife left the community 6 months later, their departure attributed to health concerns in church records. When located by investigators in 2022, David Pearson, by then a 95-year-old retired school principal living in Nashville, confirmed Margaret's account. "Mrs. Whitmore destroyed my reputation in that town with her lies," Pearson stated. "My father never believed me when I said I'd done nothing wrong. I wrote to Margaret once after I was sent away. The letter came back unopened with a note from her mother, warning that any further communication would result in legal action. I never tried again. All these years I've wondered what happened to that poor girl. What happened to Margaret Whitmore is documented in the final volume of her diaries, which covers the months leading up to Eleanor's death. The entries reveal a young woman increasingly desperate to escape her mother's control, making secret plans to flee once she turned 18. January 5th, 1944. I've been saving what little money I can. Mrs. Collins at the general store lets me keep a few cents from the grocery money each week. Mother doesn't know I've been helping Mrs. Collins with the bookkeeping. On Wednesdays, while she thinks I'm at piano lessons with Mrs. Abernathy, I have nearly $30 hidden in the loose floorboard under my bed. In 4 months, I'll be 18. I can take the bus to Little Rock, then maybe find work in Memphis or even Chicago. Somewhere so far away she'll never find me." Eleanor, however, discovered Margaret's plans. The diary entry from March 10, 1944, 4 days before Eleanor's death, describes a confrontation that turned violent. She found the money. She tore apart my room looking for letters from David because she convinced herself we've been corresponding in secret. She found the money instead. She beat me worse than ever before. Said no daughter of hers would ever leave her, that she'd rather see me dead. Then she changed, became sweet again, crying and apologizing, holding me too tight. She said she'd make it up to me, that she'd take me to New Orleans for my birthday, just the two of us. She said we could start fresh somewhere no one knows us, where we could live as we please. She used that word again, wife. Said I was meant to be her wife, not her daughter. That God had made a mistake, but she had corrected it. She's planning something. I'm afraid to sleep. The final entry, dated March 13, 1944, consists of just 3 sentences. She put something in my tea tonight. I pretended to drink it, but poured it in the plant when she wasn't looking. I think she means to take us both somewhere no one can separate us. I won't let her. The next morning, Eleanor Whitmore was found dead. The medical examiner's report from 1944, retrieved from county archives, listed the cause of death as asphyxiation due to hanging. However, when the case was reopened in 2022, forensic experts reviewing the original autopsy photographs noted several inconsistencies. Based on the ligature marks visible in the photographs, it's highly unlikely that Mrs. Whitmore died by hanging, stated Dr. James Werner, forensic pathologist with the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory. The bruising pattern is more consistent with manual strangulation. Additionally, there were defensive wounds on her hands that weren't mentioned in the original report, suggesting a struggle took place prior to death. This revelation prompted investigators to consider an alternative sequence of events, that Margaret Whitmore, after years of abuse and facing the immediate threat of being drugged and abducted, had killed her mother in self-defense. When confronted with this theory, Eliza Carter produced one final document, found among her great-aunt's possessions, a letter written by Margaret in 1990, 2 years before her death, addressed to whoever finds this after I'm gone. The letter read, in part, I have carried the weight of that night for too long. I did not hang my mother from the cellar beam. I strangled her in my bedroom when she came for me with a syringe full of morphine. She had been stealing it from Dr. Wallace for months. She meant to drug me, take me away, and force me into the twisted life she had planned for us. I fought back for the first time in my life. When it was over, I dragged her body to the cellar and staged the hanging. Deputy Blackwell suspected, I think, but he asked no questions. He looked at me with something like understanding. Perhaps he knew what kind of woman my mother truly was, or perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to accuse a traumatized girl of murder, even if he thought me capable of it. Either way, his silence was a mercy I've never deserved. The letter concluded, I have lived 50 years with the knowledge of what I did and what was done to me. I have built a life far from Elmwood, found some measure of peace through therapy and the love of good people who knew nothing of my past. I leave this record not to seek forgiveness, but in the hope that someone might understand that sometimes the only escape from a monster is to become one yourself, however briefly. May God have mercy on us both. Following the investigation, the Arkansas State Police officially closed the case in December 2022. No posthumous charges were filed against Margaret Whitmore, with authorities citing clear evidence of long-term sexual and psychological abuse and justifiable self-defense as mitigating factors. The Whitmore estate, which had stood empty since 1944, was donated by Eliza Carter to a non-profit organization that provides support services for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. The organization converted the property into a residential treatment center that opened its doors in 2023. Yet for all the documentary evidence, for all the official conclusions, mysteries remain. The diaries contain references to a hidden room somewhere on the Whitmore property that investigators were unable to locate. Margaret wrote of being punished by confinement in this space, which she called the waiting room, where Eleanor would sometimes leave her for days at a time. September 18, 1942. 3 days in the waiting room. No light except what comes through the tiny air holes. Mother says it's to teach me patience and appreciation for her company. She reads to me from the other side of the wall. More Browning. Always Browning. She says when I'm truly sorry, truly devoted, she'll let me out. I recited the poem perfectly today, with all the proper inflections. She was pleased. She opened the door. Despite extensive searches of the property, including ground-penetrating radar and the removal of several sections of flooring and drywall, this room was never found. Some investigators speculated that it might have been demolished in earlier renovations, while others suggested it might have existed only in Margaret's traumatized mind, a psychological construction rather than a physical one. Moreover, several pages had been torn from the final diary, creating a gap in the narrative between March 13th and March 17th, 1944. What those missing pages might have contained remains unknown. Perhaps most disturbing were the occasional references throughout the diaries to other young girls who visited the Whitmore estate, always when Margaret was confined to her room or the mysterious waiting room. These visits, always with daughters of Eleanor's friends, were described only peripherally in Margaret's writings, but they raised unsettling questions about whether Eleanor's predatory behavior extended beyond her daughter. In the aftermath of the investigation, 2 other families in Elmwood came forward with accounts of daughters who had experienced unexplained trauma after spending time at the Whitmore estate in the early 1940s. Both women, now in their 90s, described interactions with Eleanor that included inappropriate touching and suggestive conversations. Both had been sworn to secrecy under threat of dire consequences for themselves and their families. The Whitmore case soon attracted national attention, featured in true crime documentaries and podcasts. Amateur sleuths descended on Elmwood, combing through local records and interviewing elderly residents for any additional information about Eleanor and Margaret. The case became something of a macabre tourist attraction, much to the discomfort of long-time Elmwood residents, who preferred to forget this chapter of their town's history. Among those drawn to the case was Dr. Lillian Thorpe, a historian specializing in women's lives in the American South. During the early 20th century, Dr. Thorpe's research uncovered evidence suggesting that Eleanor Whitmore's own childhood had been marked by similar abuse. There's a generational aspect to this tragedy that can't be overlooked, Dr. Thorpe explained in her 2024 article for the Journal of American History. Eleanor's mother, Victoria Whitmore, kept her daughter in similar isolation. There are references in local newspaper society columns to Eleanor as Victoria's inseparable companion. Following the death of Eleanor's father in 1910, when Eleanor was just 13. The language used to describe their relationship mirrors Eleanor's later description of Margaret as her companion. This suggests a cycle of abuse that may have extended back even further in the family history. Dr. Thorpe's research also revealed that Victoria and Eleanor had lived for several years in New Orleans before returning to Elmwood. In 1928, the same city Eleanor had planned to take Margaret to after drugging her. Property records indicated that Victoria had owned a small house in the French Quarter, which Eleanor inherited upon Victoria's death in 1932. Eleanor sold the property the following year. The New Orleans connection is particularly significant, noted Dr. Thorpe. In her final diary entry, Margaret wrote of her mother planning to take us both somewhere no one can separate us. Given Eleanor's earlier reference to New Orleans as a place where they could live as they please, it seems likely she intended to recreate the living arrangement she had experienced with her own mother, a disturbing perpetuation of the abuse cycle. The investigation into the Whitmore case prompted the Arkansas State Police to review other apparent suicides from the same era, particularly those involving widowed women. This review led to the reopening of 2 additional cases from 1945 and 1947, both of which were eventually reclassified as homicides based on forensic re-examination of photographic evidence. As public interest in the Whitmore case grew, so too did a disturbing subculture of conspiracy theories. Online forums dedicated to the case began to speculate about wider connections, suggesting that Eleanor Whitmore had been part of a network of predators operating throughout the South in the early 20th century. These theories, while unsubstantiated, pointed to genuine gaps in the historical record and the difficulty of investigating crimes from so long ago. What is certain is that Margaret Whitmore left Arkansas immediately after graduating from high school in June 1944. County records show that she sold the Whitmore estate to a distant cousin for a nominal sum, converted her inheritance to cash, and disappeared from Elmwood's official records. Through Eliza Carter's research, it was discovered that Margaret had changed her name to Mary Wilson and relocated to Philadelphia, where she worked as a secretary before putting herself through nursing school. She never married and had no children. She left no survivors except distant relatives like Carter, who had never known her. Among Margaret's personal effects, which were forwarded to Carter following the conclusion of the investigation, was a well-worn copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's collected works. Every page containing sonnets from the Portuguese, Eleanor's favorite poems to read to her daughter during the years of abuse, had been meticulously cut out. Also included was a small cardboard box containing a gold ring with the initials EW and MW engraved inside the band. The ring had been broken in half. The story of Eleanor and Margaret Whitmore might have ended there, consigned to history as a tragic example of familial abuse and its devastating consequences. But in April 2023, during renovations of the treatment center established on the former Whitmore property, construction workers made a discovery that reignited interest in the case and suggested that its darkest chapters remained unwritten. While removing a section of brick wall in the cellar to address a persistent moisture problem, workers uncovered a small metal box that had been sealed within the wall itself. Inside the box was a leather-bound journal, its pages water-damaged, but still partially legible. The handwriting matched Eleanor Whitmore's, as confirmed by comparison with her letters and legal documents preserved in county records. The journal contained entries dating from 1928 to 1934, covering the period immediately following Eleanor's return to Elmwood, with 4-year-old Margaret, up until the death of Eleanor's husband, Jonathan. The contents of these entries painted a picture even more disturbing than what had been revealed in Margaret's diaries. October 15, 1928. Mother would be proud of what I've begun. The groundwork must be laid carefully as she laid it for me. Jonathan suspects nothing. He sees only a devoted mother, as father saw in mother. Margaret is still too young, but already I'm shaping her, molding her as I was molded. Mother promised me I would find the same fulfillment with my own daughter, and I begin to see it now. How fortunate that Margaret resembles me so strongly. Anyone who might question her paternity need only look at us side by side to be reassured. Our secret remains safe. This and other entries suggested the unthinkable, that Jonathan Whitmore might not have been Margaret's biological father, raising questions about the true nature of Eleanor's relationship with her own mother, Victoria. The final pages of Eleanor's journal contained increasingly erratic writings about a sacred tradition that she was destined to continue, references to other families with similar arrangements, and lists of young girls' names, including some who had been mentioned in Margaret's diaries as visitors to the estate. Most disturbing was a hand-drawn map of the Whitmore property, with a section of the cellar wall marked with an X and the notation, "VW waits here." When investigators removed this section of wall, they discovered a small sealed chamber containing human remains, later identified through dental records as those of Victoria Whitmore, who had supposedly died of pneumonia in New Orleans in 1932. Forensic examination of Victoria's remains revealed a fracture to the hyoid bone consistent with strangulation, the same cause of death as Eleanor's. This discovery suggested a pattern. Victoria may have abused Eleanor, who then killed her mother and concealed her body before returning to Elmwood to continue the cycle of abuse with Margaret, who ultimately killed Eleanor in self-defense. The investigation into these new findings continues, with authorities now attempting to identify the other names mentioned in Eleanor's journal and determine whether they too were victims. The case has expanded beyond Elmwood to other communities throughout Arkansas and Louisiana, where similar patterns of isolated widows and their daughters have been identified in historical records. For the residents of Elmwood, the Whitmore case has become a wound that refuses to heal, a reminder that the most horrific crimes can unfold behind the respectable facades of even the most prominent families. The treatment center established on the property has become both a place of healing and a monument to generational trauma, its very walls perhaps still holding secrets that may never come to light. As for Margaret Whitmore, who died believing her terrible secret had died with her, her final letter offers perhaps the only fitting epitaph for this tragic story. The past is never truly buried. It waits patient as the grave for someone to unearth it. I have tried to put enough earth between myself and what happened in that house to let me breathe freely. But I have always known that someday the truth would rise to the surface, like a body buried in shallow ground. The question that haunts investigators and historians alike is whether all of the truth has yet risen, or whether darker revelations still await discovery in the shadowed corners of the Whitmore estate, and the scattered records of those whose lives intersected with this family's terrible legacy. What is certain is that the investigation has expanded well beyond the borders of Elmwood. Police departments in 3 states are now reviewing historical cases that bear similarities to the Whitmore situation. Researchers at the University of Arkansas have established a dedicated archive to collect and analyze materials related to the case, including oral histories from elderly residents who remember the Whitmore family. And somewhere, perhaps, other diaries wait to be found, other voices silenced by abuse and manipulation that might yet speak their truths. For as Margaret Whitmore wrote in her final diary entry before the pages were torn away, some stories refuse to end, even when their tellers are gone. Some horrors echo through time, and some secrets, no matter how deeply they're buried, claw their way back into the light. What would you do if you learned that the horrors of the Whitmore case extended far beyond a single family's tragedy? That what appeared to be an isolated instance of abuse might actually be a small piece of a much larger, more sinister pattern spanning generations and state lines. The discovery of Victoria Whitmore's remains in the sealed chamber of the cellar wall prompted authorities to expand their investigation beyond the borders of Elmwood. In June 2023, the Arkansas State Police established Task Force Penumbra, dedicated to investigating potential connections between the Whitmore case and similar historical incidents throughout the South. This isn't just about what happened to one girl in one house anymore, explained Detective Aaron Michaels, who headed the task force. The evidence suggests an organized effort to perpetuate a specific type of abuse across multiple families. The names in Eleanor's journal, the references to a tradition, and similar arrangements. These point to something more systematic than we initially believed. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a series of letters found in a hidden compartment in Eleanor's writing desk. The correspondence, dating from 1935 to 1942, was between Eleanor and 3 other women in different southern states: Josephine Blackwood of Natchez, Mississippi, Catherine DuPont of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Elizabeth Hargrove of Mobile, Alabama. The letters, written in a coded language that investigators took months to decipher, detailed the women's efforts to isolate and groom their daughters in a manner identical to Eleanor's treatment of Margaret. I am proceeding as instructed with my Lily, wrote Josephine Blackwood in a letter dated April 1938. The separation from outside influences is nearly complete. My husband suspects nothing, believing my concern for her delicate constitution explanation enough for her removal from school. Soon, she will understand her true purpose, as we all came to understand ours. The investigation led to the exhumation of graves in Natchez and Baton Rouge. Forensic examination revealed that both Josephine Blackwood and Catherine DuPont, like Eleanor Whitmore, had died of manual strangulation, though their deaths had been ruled suicides or accidents at the time. Their daughters, like Margaret Whitmore, had left their hometowns immediately after high school and changed their names. We have to consider the possibility that these girls, like Margaret, fought back against their abusers, said Dr. Rebecca Foster. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Years of isolation and abuse, followed by the mother's death just as the daughter approached adulthood, followed by the daughter's immediate flight and complete severance from her former identity. Lily Blackwood, located in 2023 living under the name Laura Bennett in a retirement community in Arizona, confirmed the investigators' theory. We found each other, you know, the 87-year-old woman revealed in her testimony. Not right away, it took years, but somehow we recognized something in each other when we met. Margaret was the first one I found, or she found me. We were both nursing students in Philadelphia, something in the way she flinched when our supervisor touched her shoulder. I just knew. Later, we found Patricia DuPont. She was calling herself Patricia Davis by then. And finally, Edith Hargrove, who changed her name to Emma Harrison. According to Bennett, the four women formed a support group of sorts, meeting regularly throughout the 1950s and 60s to help each other process their trauma. None of them ever reported their mother's deaths as anything other than suicides, fearing the legal consequences and public exposure. We made a pact to take the truth to our graves, Bennett said, but Margaret must have decided otherwise in the end. Her letter changed everything. Bennett's testimony led investigators to a storage unit in Philadelphia, rented under the name Mary Wilson, Margaret's assumed identity. Inside were dozens of journals and photographs documenting the women's meetings, as well as their efforts to identify and reach out to other potential victims. They knew there were more of us, Bennett explained. They had heard the same phrases, from their mothers, references to a sacred tradition, a special destiny. They knew their mothers had corresponded with other women. They tried to track down every name, every connection. The journals contained references to a group the women called the Maternal Order, which they believed had originated in New Orleans in the late 1800s. According to their research, the group consisted of women who rejected traditional maternal roles in favor of romantic relationships with their daughters, relationships they justified through an elaborate mythology involving reincarnation and divine selection. They believed they were special, chosen, Bennett explained, that normal rules and morality didn't apply to them, that what they were doing wasn't abuse but elevation, preparing their daughters for some higher purpose. This revelation prompted researchers to delve into historical records from New Orleans, particularly focusing on the period when Victoria Whitmore had lived there with young Eleanor. What they found in the archives of a defunct women's social club called the Daughters of Persephone sent shockwaves through the investigation. The club, ostensibly dedicated to Greek mythology and literature, appeared to have served as a front for meetings of women involved in this disturbing tradition. Membership records from 1890 through 1930 included Victoria Whitmore, as well as the mothers of Josephine Blackwood, Catherine DuPont, and Elizabeth Hargrove. It's a generational pattern, explained Dr. Lillian Thorpe. These women were themselves victims who became perpetrators, continuing the cycle with their own daughters. The psychological mechanisms at work, the normalization of abuse, the elaborate justifications, the isolation from outside influence, are consistent with how cults operate. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a manuscript in the New Orleans Historical Society archives, purportedly written by the founder of the Daughters of Persephone, Eliza St. Clair, in 1887, titled The Divine Maternal. The text outlined a philosophy in which certain chosen mothers were destined to form complete unions with their daughters, who were believed to be the reincarnations of the mother's own mothers. "The circle must remain unbroken," St. Clair wrote. "The daughter becomes the mother becomes the daughter, through the sacred bond. The world outside cannot understand the perfection of our love, so we must shield it from profane eyes, nurture it in secret until it blossoms into its full glory." The investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that this group had operated continuously from the late 19th century until at least the 1950s, with branches in multiple southern states. The women involved were typically widowed, early, often under suspicious circumstances, leaving them free to focus entirely on their daughters. "The level of coordination is what's truly frightening," noted Detective Michaels. "These women helped each other, advised each other, shared techniques for breaking down their daughters' resistance, and they were careful to maintain respectable public personas, active in church, involved in charity work, regarded as pillars of their communities." The revelation of this network raised disturbing questions about how many other victims might have existed, and whether any branches of the group might still be operating. Task Force Penumbra expanded to include investigators from Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Tennessee, all reviewing historical cases of widows and daughters with patterns similar to the Whitmore situation. For the survivors who had been identified, the investigation brought both validation and renewed trauma. Laura Bennett, formerly Lily Blackwood, expressed both relief and regret. "All these years we thought we were alone in what happened to us," she said. "Finding out there was this whole organization behind it is horrifying, but it also confirms what we always suspected, that this was bigger than just our individual mothers being monsters. They were part of something that taught them to be this way. I only wish Margaret had lived to see this truth come to light." She searched the hardest for answers. In October 2023, construction workers renovating a historic home in the Garden District of New Orleans made a discovery that added yet another layer to the investigation. Hidden in a sealed wall cavity similar to the one that had concealed Victoria Whitmore's remains was a collection of photographs and documents dating from 1890 to 1910. The materials documented meetings of the daughters of Persephone, including ritual induction ceremonies for new members and their daughters. The photographs showed women and girls in white dresses, wearing distinctive pendant necklaces, bearing the pomegranate symbol associated with the Persephone myth. "The pendant was passed from mother to daughter as part of the initiation," explained Dr. Thorpe. "It symbolized the mother's claim on the daughter, just as Hades claimed Persephone with the pomegranate seeds in the Greek myth, forcing her to return to him in the underworld for part of each year." This discovery prompted Eliza Carter to search through the personal effects inherited from her great-aunt Margaret. Among them, she found a gold pendant necklace with a pomegranate design, broken in half and sealed in the same box as the ring Eleanor had given Margaret. The breaking of these symbolic items seemed to represent Margaret's rejection of her mother's claim and the tradition she represented. As the investigation continued to uncover the extent of the maternal order's reach, a disturbing possibility emerged, that the organization might have evolved rather than disappeared. Researchers noted that the coded language used in the women's correspondence had changed over time, becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect. There's evidence suggesting that by the 1950s, members were communicating through seemingly innocent newspaper personal ads, said Detective Michaels. By the 1970s, they may have established legitimate-appearing women's support groups as fronts. We have to consider the possibility that modern iterations exist, perhaps using online forums or social media. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered a private online group called Demeter's Circle, established in 2006, whose discussions contained veiled references to the tradition and mother-daughter transcendence. The group used symbolism and terminology strikingly similar to that found in the historical Daughters of Persephone materials. For the residents of Elmwood and the other communities where these horrors had unfolded, the expanding investigation brought a growing sense of collective guilt. How had so many people failed to recognize what was happening to these girls? How had the abuse continued for generations without intervention? People saw what they wanted to see, suggested Dr. Foster. A widow devoted to her daughter didn't raise suspicions. If the daughter seemed withdrawn or troubled, it was attributed to grief or shyness. The women involved were careful to maintain respectable public images, and there was a general reluctance in those times to interfere in what were considered private family matters. This reluctance to interfere, this collective looking away, had allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. It had allowed a network of predators to operate behind a veil of respectability, claiming victim after victim across generations. The treatment center established on the former Whitmore property became a symbol of this historical failure and the determination to do better. In addition to providing services to abuse survivors, it now housed a research center dedicated to studying the warning signs of familial abuse and training social workers, teachers, and healthcare providers to recognize and respond to those signs. What happened to Margaret Whitmore and the others should never have been possible, said the center's director, Dr. Maya Rodriguez. We owe it to them and to every child at risk today to learn from these historical failures. The most dangerous predators are those who appear above suspicion. The respected community member, the devoted parent. We need to look beneath the surface, to hear what isn't being said, to notice who isn't present in the community and why. The investigation continues to this day, with new connections being discovered and new victims identified. The full extent of the maternal order's reach may never be known, particularly given how many of its members and victims are now deceased. But the breaking of silence, begun by Margaret Whitmore's final letter and continued by survivors like Laura Bennett, has shed light on a darkness that festered in secrecy for more than a century. For Eliza Carter, the revelation of her family's terrible history has become a mission. She has established a foundation dedicated to researching and exposing historical patterns of abuse, particularly those hidden behind veils of respectability and tradition. I never knew Margaret, Carter said in a recent interview, but I feel I know her now through her writings, through the incredible courage she showed in breaking free, and through her determination to leave a record of what happened to her. She couldn't bring herself to speak the truth while she lived, but she made sure it would be heard after she was gone. I want to honor that courage by making sure this history isn't buried again. As new evidence continues to emerge, as connections between seemingly isolated incidents are discovered, the true scope of the maternal order's influence becomes clearer. What began as the investigation of one family's tragedy has expanded into an examination of how abuse can become systematized, justified, and perpetuated across generations. The story of Margaret Whitmore, a girl groomed to become her mother's wife, who found the strength to break free and forge her own identity, has become emblematic of both the human capacity for cruelty and the resilience of those who survive it. Her diaries, now preserved in the University of Arkansas archives, stand as testimony to a horror that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. Yet even as answers emerge, new questions arise. How many other victims remain undiscovered? How many other families harbor similar secrets? And how many modern iterations of the maternal order might still exist, adapting their methods to the contemporary world while maintaining their fundamental perversion of the mother-daughter relationship?